Imagine waking up before sunrise every single morning, pulling on a stiff uniform in a freezing cold attic room, and heading downstairs to begin a day that will not end until nearly 10 o'clock at night. You will polish silver, scrub carpets on your hands and knees, carry heavy tea trays down long stone corridors, and light fires in dozens of fireplaces. You will do all of this in near total silence. You cannot speak unless you are spoken to. You cannot make eye contact unless it is invited. And if you happen to walk into a room moments after a member of the royal family has stepped out, you must stop, straighten your back, and bow or curtsy to the empty space they left behind. This is not a scene from a Victorian novel. This is what daily life looked like for the men and women who worked inside Balmoral Castle, the royal family's private Scottish estate nestled deep in the Cairngorms Mountains of Aberdeenshire. For generations, this castle has been presented to the world as a fairy tale retreat, a place where royalty escapes the pressure of public life and reconnects with nature, tradition, and each other. The postcards show sparkling granite walls, rolling green hills, and Highland deer grazing peacefully in the golden light of a Scottish afternoon. But behind that picture-perfect image, something else entirely was going on. And in recent years, the people who lived and worked inside those walls have started talking. Some whispered. Some leaked documents. Some walked away without a word and never looked back. And what they have revealed paints a portrait of a working environment so far removed from the glamour of its exterior that it is genuinely difficult to believe the two realities exist within the same set of walls. This is the story of what really happened inside Balmoral Castle. And by the time you finish hearing it, you will understand exactly why so many people chose to leave. Balmoral Castle has been in royal hands since 1852, when Prince Albert purchased the estate after spotting an advertisement for the property. He paid what was then considered a significant sum, and within a few years, the original house on the land was demolished and replaced with the grand granite castle that still stands today. Albert was deeply involved in the design, sketching elements himself, and ensuring the building reflected his own tastes and sensibilities. The estate eventually grew to cover more than 50,000 acres, encompassing mountains, forests, rivers, and enough land to swallow entire city district whole. The castle itself contained a remarkable number of rooms, spread across narrow corridors that were reportedly designed that way on purpose, the idea being that family members would bump into one another more often, and therefore grow closer. Whether or not that worked for the family is a matter of some debate. What is not debatable is what those narrow corridors meant for the staff who spent their days moving through them quietly, invisibly, trying not to be noticed. Because Balmoral is privately owned by the royal family rather than being a crown property, operates under different rules than many other royal residences. The income it generates, from renting cottages to tourists, selling timber, and leasing land, flows directly to the family. And because it sits outside the boundaries of many standard employment oversight frameworks that would apply to ordinary British workplaces, the people employed there have historically had very little recourse when things went wrong. That combination, private ownership, remote location, culture of absolute secrecy, and limited outside scrutiny, created conditions that allowed serious problems to develop quietly over many decades without anyone on the outside being fully aware of what was happening. To understand the scale of what workers were dealing with, you have to start with the basics. The hours were extraordinary. 15 and 18-hour days were not occasional emergencies. They were the norm during the royal family's annual summer stay, which typically ran through the autumn. During this period, the estate swelled with activity. Hundreds of staff members were required to manage the hunting, the cooking, the cleaning, the horses, the grounds, and the constant stream of guests that accompanied the family. The physical demands of the work were genuinely punishing. For decades, vacuum cleaners were banned inside the castle. The official reason given was that Queen Elizabeth disliked the sound they made. The practical consequence was that maids were required to clean carpets and rugs using handheld horsehair brushes, working on their knees for hours at a time. Accounts from former workers described the effort required to brush even a single hallway as taking the better part of an hour. Multiply that across a castle with well over 100 rooms, add the staircases, sitting rooms, dining halls, and private quarters, and you begin to understand what a single cleaning shift actually involved. Wrists ached so badly from the repetitive motion that some workers struggled to hold their cutlery at mealtimes. Aprons had to be rinsed multiple times a day because of the dust and debris dislodged from carpets that were, in some cases, over a century old. Former staff have described the work as relentless in a way that is hard to fully communicate to someone who has not experienced it. There was always more to do. The standard was impossibly high, and falling short had consequences. Alongside the physical labor came an equally demanding set of behavioral rules. Silence was not simply encouraged, it was enforced. Plus, workers were not permitted to speak unless directly addressed by a member of the family or senior household management. They were not to react to anything they overheard. If a royal conversation was taking place nearby, the appropriate response was to carry on as though you had heard absolutely nothing. Your face neutral, your movements smooth and unobtrusive. Former workers have described developing elaborate systems of hand signals and quiet gestures to communicate with one another during service, because verbal communication was simply not permitted. The atmosphere in the corridors of Balmoral during the royal family's stay was, by multiple accounts, quieter than a library. Not because of any sense of reverence or awe, but because the consequences of getting it wrong were swift and serious. One former maid described overhearing a private conversation by accident while going about her duties and receiving a written warning the following morning. She had not repeated anything she heard. She had not even acknowledged hearing it. But someone had noticed the slight change in her expression, the brief flicker of reaction on her face, and that was enough. 2 such warnings, and you lost not only your job, but also the seasonal bonus that represented a significant portion of your annual income. The money tells its own story. For the level of skill, physical endurance, and personal sacrifice that the job required. The wages paid to Balmoral's domestic staff were, across multiple decades and under multiple monarchs, genuinely inadequate. In the early 1980s, entry-level housemaids at the estate were earning a salary that left them barely above the national average, despite working significantly longer hours than a standard full-time position. Living on the estate without the freedom that comes with living independently, and performing work that required both physical strength and a high degree of trained skill. Male workers in outdoor roles on the same estate were consistently paid more than their female counterparts in domestic positions, a disparity that caused quiet but persistent frustration among the staff. Moving up the ranks offered only modest improvement. Promotions took years to materialize, and the pay increases attached to them were small enough that many workers found themselves calculating whether the time and effort required to advance was actually worth it. The answer, for a growing number of them, was no. The accommodation provided to staff added another layer of difficulty. For many years, maids and lower-ranked household workers slept in attic rooms that were, to put it plainly, not fit for the purpose. In the colder months, temperatures in these rooms dropped to levels that made sleep genuinely uncomfortable. Hot water was rationed to a brief window each morning. Windows were poorly insulated against the fierce Scottish Highland weather. Workers have described waking up on winter mornings to find their breath had condensed and frozen on the inside of the glass. For years, requests to improve these conditions were either dismissed or deferred with vague promises that never materialized. It was not until the mid-1990s, following an external audit that formally flagged the living conditions as inadequate, that meaningful improvements were finally made. By that point, many of the workers who had endured those conditions for the longest had already left. When you add all of this together, the excessive hours, the physically damaging work conditions, the enforced silence, the inadequate pay, the poor accommodation, and the complete absence of any real avenue to raise concerns, a picture emerges that is very different from the dignified, prestigious service that working at a royal estate was publicly portrayed to be. The culture of silence extended far beyond simply not repeating what you heard during working hours. Every member of staff employed at Balmoral was required to commit to a secrecy agreement that bound them for life. These agreements, strengthened and updated over the decades, effectively prevented workers from ever publicly discussing anything they had experienced, witnessed, or felt during their time at the estate. The practical effect of this was to give the institution enormous power over the people who worked for it, even after they had left. Workers who felt mistreated, underpaid, or poorly treated had no meaningful way to speak out without risking serious legal and financial consequences. Journalists and researchers who tried to piece together the reality of working life inside the castle found themselves blocked at every turn by legal agreements that their sources were afraid to violate. This is not merely a historical observation. As recently as 2022, these agreements were updated and renewed, ensuring they remained legally robust and enforceable into the modern era. Former workers considering speaking to journalists or participating in broader conversations about labor conditions in royal households were well aware that doing so could expose them to legal action with financial penalties that could be genuinely ruinous. The few accounts that have made it into the public record over the years came at significant personal cost to the people who shared them. One woman who worked at the estate in the 1980s and eventually shared her experiences through an intermediary lost her royal cottage, severed every connection she had to her former life in royal service, and spent her remaining years largely isolated from the community she had once been part of. The message her experience sent to those still working within the system was unmistakable. Loyalty is expected. Silence is mandatory. Stepping outside those boundaries comes with a price. And yet, people kept talking. Not loudly, not on the record, and not without careful consideration of the consequences. But the accounts kept surfacing. In memoirs, in anonymous forum posts, in leaked internal documents, in reviews left on employment websites, the reality of working life at Balmoral kept pushing through the official silence. The contrast between how the estate appeared from the outside and what it felt like from the inside was something that struck virtually every worker who has ever spoken about their experience there. Balmoral is genuinely beautiful. The landscape surrounding it is among the most dramatic and awe-inspiring in the British Isles. The castle itself, with its white granite walls catching the light on a clear Highland morning, has a kind of fairy tale grandeur that photographs simply cannot do justice to. For many young people who came to work there, often fresh from school or from small towns where the idea of working for the royal family carried enormous prestige, the initial experience of arriving at the estate was genuinely thrilling. The sense of stepping into history, of being connected to something larger than yourself, of being trusted with the private lives of people whose faces appeared on stamps and banknotes, was powerful and real. But that feeling, for most of them, did not last long. The gap between the romance of working at a royal castle and the reality of cleaning stone floors at 6 in the morning while suffering from cracked, aching hands became apparent very quickly. And once it did, the question of whether the privilege of the setting was worth the personal cost became increasingly difficult to answer in the affirmative. Former workers have described the experience of serving at the Gillies Ball, the annual evening when staff and royals came together for dancing and a temporary suspension of the normal rules, as one of the few genuinely joyful memories they carried from their time there. On this one night each year, the rigid hierarchy relaxed slightly. Staff and family members danced in the same room. Some workers were permitted to address senior royals by their first names. The usual silence was replaced by music and laughter. And then midnight came. The royals left, the bows were exchanged, and the next morning everything returned to exactly what it had been before. For many workers, the contrast made things harder rather than easier. A single evening of warmth and humanity thrown against the backdrop of the rest of the year only sharpened the sense of what was missing during the other 364 days. In the years between 2023 and 2025, the situation at the royal estates reached a kind of breaking point that was impossible to conceal. At King Charles's Highgrove estate, the gardening team experienced a collapse so dramatic that it drew public attention despite the palace's best efforts to manage the narrative. Out of a full team of 12 gardeners, 11 left within an approximately 18-month period. The one who remained was, by multiple accounts, not planning to stay much longer either. The work at Highgrove was demanding by any standard. The gardens there are among the most celebrated private gardens in Britain, visited by tens of thousands of people each year, and maintained to an exceptionally high standard. The staff responsible for that standard were working weeks of up to 60 hours, caring for 15 acres of intensively managed garden space, and earning wages that, after tax, left them hovering barely above minimum wage. When one worker suffered a serious shoulder injury while moving heavy loads of compost without assistance, and then found himself navigating a benefit system that provided a fraction of his normal income while he recovered, the simmering frustration of the entire team reached its limit. Within days, the majority of the gardening staff had submitted their resignations simultaneously. Internal correspondence that was subsequently leaked described the working conditions in detail. Workers were expected to fulfill requests that arrived via handwritten notes, sometimes demanding tasks, such as removing all visible weeds overnight or replanting hundreds of flowers within a 3-day window, that were physically impossible for a team of the size employed. The expectation that these requests would be carried out, regardless of the physical or logistical reality involved, reflected a fundamental disconnect between the people giving the instructions and the people required to carry them out. The palace acknowledged that something had gone wrong and brought in external support to assess and address the situation. But the acknowledgement came after the damage had already been done, after the people who had built their working lives around those gardens had already walked away. At Balmoral itself, the summer of 2025 brought events that proved impossible to manage quietly. In early August, with the estate open to visitors and the regular rhythms of the summer season in full swing, something remarkable happened. Approximately 2/3 of the room attendants, the people responsible for maintaining the guest and family quarters within the castle, walked off the job overnight. Their reasons were specific and had been building for some time. The physical conditions in their accommodation had deteriorated to a point where several workers were sleeping in spaces with failing roofs. Requests for basic repairs had been made repeatedly and repeatedly deferred. When it became clear that nothing was going to change in the immediate future, and that the expectation was simply for them to continue absorbing the discomfort while maintaining the immaculate standard required of them in their professional duties, they collectively decided they had had enough. The gates of Balmoral closed to the public the following morning. The official explanation referenced a weather event. The actual explanation was that there were not enough staff remaining to safely and properly manage the castle's operations. It was the first time the estate had closed in such circumstances in well over 2 decades. The workers who had stayed behind to manage as best they could describe those days as surreal. Rain was pushing through old windows into rooms that were supposed to be kept in perfect condition. The contrast between the standard of maintenance applied to the spaces occupied by the royal family and their guests and the standard applied to the spaces where the staff slept and lived was, in the words of one account, something you could not look at directly for too long without it making you angry. What makes all of this particularly striking is that it was not happening in a context of financial hardship. The sovereign grant, the public funding mechanism through which the royal family receives money for official duties and the maintenance of their official residences, had grown substantially in the years leading up to these events. Tourism income at the royal estates had increased significantly following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, as public interest in the monarchy and its associated sites intensified during the period of mourning and transition. Analysis of publicly available financial information and leaked internal documents suggested that the cost of meaningfully improving wages and working conditions across the royal households would have been modest in the context of the overall estate budget. Estimates pointed to a figure that represented less than the cost of routine maintenance work on private infrastructure within the estates, infrastructure that was consistently maintained and upgraded while worker accommodation and wages stagnated. This disparity between what was spent on things and what was spent on people became the central grievance in the accounts of those who left. It was not simply that the work was hard work, done in a beautiful place, in service of something with genuine historical significance, was something many of these workers had been genuinely prepared for. What they were not prepared for, and what ultimately drove them away, was the sense that the institution they were serving did not consider their basic comfort, dignity, and financial security to be worth the same level of investment as its carpets, its gardens, and its granite walls. The young maid, known in one account only as Heather Glenn, put something into words in mid-2023 that resonated with thousands of people who read it. She had asked for emergency leave to be with her mother before a serious surgery. She had used barely any of her allocated leave days that year. Her request was denied. She was needed to attend to laundry duties. She quit that day and she told her story online. The response was overwhelming, not because her story was unique, but precisely because it was not. Thousands of people recognized in her account the same dynamic they had either experienced themselves or watched someone they cared about go through. The sense of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that your family, your health, your personal life, your dignity, matter less than the immediate operational requirements of the institution employing you. What happened next was telling. Within 2 weeks, a new job advertisement appeared for her former role. The pay offered was higher than what she and her colleagues had been earning. When it became necessary to attract new workers quickly, the money was apparently available. It had always been available. The choice had simply been made, over and over again, not to direct it toward the people already doing the work. There is something genuinely poignant about the way the workers, who eventually left Balmoral Castle, described the place they were walking away from. Almost none of them had only negative things to say about it. They described the landscape with real love. They spoke about the satisfaction of maintaining something beautiful and historic. Many of them talked about individual moments of kindness or connection that they carried with them long after they left. What wore them down was not any single catastrophic event. It was the accumulation, the cold attic rooms that were promised to be improved and never were, the aching wrists that nobody asked about, the written warnings for the crime of an involuntary facial expression, the curses to empty rooms, the silence that was less about respect and more about control, the wages that did not move while the estate's revenues grew. The gap between how working at Balmoral was talked about in the wider world and what it actually felt like to live it from the inside. People can endure a great deal when they feel that the place they are giving their time and energy to sees them, values them, and would go to bat for them if they needed it. And people will leave regardless of how beautiful the setting is or how historically significant the work is when they come to understand that none of those things are true. That is the real reason they left. Not any single scandal, not any single policy, but the gradual, undeniable realization that the institution at the center of one of the most carefully maintained images of tradition, duty, and dignity in the world did not extend those same values to the people who made it function. That is the story Balmoral's granite walls could never quite manage to keep inside. And now you know it.